The email arrived on a Tuesday. We've decided to move in a different direction. I read it twice. I understood it perfectly. I was reading the name in the TO field correctly. Callum Reed, Senior M&A Analyst. 14 months into acquisition deal the firm had. 14 words, Tuesday, Friday. I looked out the window at the city below. Thought about the 200 million. On my desktop that nobody else in that. Then I thought, they're going to find that out the hard way. They always are. 14 words. Your last day will be Friday, die. Not because I didn't understand it. I read it twice because I wanted to make sure. Mine, 7 years at Hargrove Capital. Structuring the most complex, attempted in a decade. I set my phone face down on my desk. 31 floors of other people's problems. And I, dollar merger sitting in a folder. Building fully understood, I was right. Before we go further, if you've ever been the person who knew exactly where everything was, exactly how everything worked, and watched someone decide you were expendable anyway, subscribe. Drop a comment. Tell me your version. I read every single one. And trust me, what happens to Hargrove Capital 3 weeks after? I walk out that door is worth staying for. My name is Callum Reed. I am not and have never been the loudest person in any room. I don't play golf. I don't do client dinners. With the easy charm that gets you noticed. In firms like Hargrove, what I do is read deals the way other people read faces. Every number A tells something. Every structure a choice someone made for a reason. Every clause a small window into what the other side is afraid of. I joined Hargrove Capital 7 years ago as a junior analyst straight out of a postgraduate program that most people at Hargrove had never heard of. Not because it wasn't good, it was exceptionally good, but because it wasn't the right school, not the right name, not the right network. My hiring manager at the time, a woman named Patricia, told me in my first week that I'd need to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously as the candidates who came in trailing the right surnames. She said it without apology, which I respected. It was the most useful thing anyone told me in 7 years. I worked twice as hard. Within 3 years, I was running due diligence on mid-market acquisitions that senior analysts twice my age were treating as background noise. I found things in data rooms that other people missed. Not because I was smarter, but because I stayed longer. I read further. I asked the question nobody else thought to ask because they'd already decided they knew the answer. Within 5 years, I was the person they called when a deal was complicated, when the numbers didn't add up cleanly, when the other side was hiding something and nobody could figure out where. I didn't have a VP title. I had a senior analyst title and a reputation that operated slightly above my pay grade, which suited me fine because I understood how Hargrove worked. Titles came from the right schools and the right handshakes. Results came from people like me. Both sides of that equation understood the arrangement. It was uncomfortable and it was functional, and for 5 years more or less it held. Then Marcus Vane arrived. Marcus Vane was 34 years old, had an MBA from a school with a very good squash team, and was the nephew of Hargrove's newly appointed CEO, Gerald Vane. I want to be clear that I have nothing against nepotism as a concept. Families support each other. I understand that. What I have something against is incompetence being installed in a load-bearing position and everyone in the building deciding simultaneously that they cannot see it. Marcus was brought in as a junior analyst. Within 4 months, he had been promoted to analyst. Within 6 months, he was sitting in on deal meetings that he had no business sitting in on, asking questions that revealed, with impressive consistency, that he had not read the briefing materials. I watched this happen the way you watch a car slowly roll toward a junction, without anyone at the wheel, with a kind of detached professional alarm. The deal I was working on at the time was the Alderton-Moor acquisition, a $200 million purchase of a mid-sized logistics company by one of Hargrove's longest-standing clients, Veritas Group. I had been structuring it for 14 months. It was, without question, the most complex deal I had worked on in 7 years, 3 subsidiary entities, a cross-border tax exposure that had taken me 6 weeks to map, a pension liability that the sellers had buried in footnote 34 of their 2021 accounts, and a material adverse change clause that I had personally negotiated over 11 rounds of revision because the other side's lawyers were very good and very determined. I knew that deal the way a surgeon knows an anatomy, every nerve, every risk, every place where one wrong cut would cause something to collapse that couldn't be put back together. In month 13, Marcus Vane was assigned to shadow me on it. I showed him the structure. I walked him through the subsidiary map. I explained the pension liability and why it mattered and what would happen if it wasn't correctly accounted for in the final valuation. He nodded throughout. He took notes on a very expensive notepad. He asked at the end whether the client played golf. I said I didn't know. He said that was probably something worth finding out. The email arrived 6 weeks later. 14 words. I found out the same day, through Marcus, who told me with the particular discomfort of someone who knows they are holding the wrong end of something, that the decision had come from Gerald directly. The firm was streamlining. They were investing in developing internal talent. The Alderton-Moor deal would be transitioned to Marcus, who would be supported by a team of junior analysts. I asked Marcus how long the transition period would be. He said there wouldn't be one. Friday was Friday. I nodded. I went back to my desk. I spent the next 3 days doing something that Marcus and Gerald and everyone else in that building did not know I was doing. I documented everything, not as sabotage, not as leverage, simply as record. The deal structure, the risk map, the pension liability calculation, the MAE clause history, every email, every negotiation note, every internal memo where I had flagged a concern that had been nodded at and filed somewhere irrelevant. I organized it into a master file, complete, accurate, time-stamped. Then I saved a copy for myself, which I was entirely entitled to do, as it contained nothing proprietary beyond what I had personally produced, and then I left the original on the shared drive with a note that said, "Full Alderton-Moor documentation. All open items flagged in red." On Friday afternoon, I cleared my desk. Security walked me to the elevator as they do. The doors closed. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal. I thought 3 weeks, maybe 4. It took 19 days. I want to tell you that I spent those 19 days in quiet, dignified contemplation, that I reflected, that I read, that I took long walks and thought about what I wanted from the next chapter. I did some of that. I also, in the spirit of honesty, spent approximately 4 of those 19 days doing something I had not done in 7 years, which was nothing, absolutely nothing. I sat in my flat. I made coffee at a pace that suggested I had nowhere to be, and I watched the city do its thing without me in it. It was unexpectedly excellent. On day 5, I called a woman named Soraya Okonkwo, who ran a boutique advisory firm called Meridian Partners that I had crossed paths with twice in 7 years, once on opposite sides of a deal, once at a conference where we had agreed, over very average wine, that most of the problems in M&A were caused by people who confuse confidence with competence. She had given me her card both times. I told her I was available. She said, "I know. I heard this morning. When can you start?" I said, "Tell me about the deal first." She told me about the deal. It was interesting. I said 2 weeks. I wanted to rest. And she said, "Fine, 2 weeks." But she was sending me the data room access anyway because she knew I wouldn't be able to help myself. She was right. I looked at it that evening. There were 3 things wrong with the structure within the first 40 minutes. I sent her a note. She replied, "This is why I've been waiting for you to be available for 3 years. I made more coffee. I went to bed. Somewhere across the city, the Alderton-Moor deal was in Marcus Vane's hands." The call came on a Tuesday, 19 days after my last day at Hargrove, 7 days before I was due to start at Meridian Partners. The number was Gerald Vane's direct line. I recognized it because it had called me in 7 years, exactly twice, both times to tell me I had done good work on something, in the brief way that people tell you that you've done good work when they want you to keep doing it, without asking for more money. I let it ring. He called again an hour later. I let it ring again. His assistant called 20 minutes after that. I answered because I have nothing against assistants. They are always the most competent people in any building, and she asked if I was available to speak with Gerald at my earliest convenience. I said I was fairly busy but could probably find some time later in the week. She said it was quite urgent. I said I understood and that I would do my best, and that she should feel free to send me an email in the meantime. She sent the email 7 minutes later. I read it carefully. The Alderton-Moor deal was in trouble. The acquisition was scheduled to close in 11 days. Veritas Group, the client, had received a revised due diligence report from their own advisors that flagged 2 items: the pension liability in footnote 34 and a discrepancy in the cross-border tax exposure calculation that suggested the original figure was understated by approximately $4.2 million. Neither of these items were new. Both of them were in my documentation, flagged in red, with a note attached to each that explained exactly what it was, why it mattered, and what needed to be done about it before close. Marcus, apparently, had not read the documentation flagged in red, or had read it and not understood it, or had understood it and decided it would resolve itself. I am being charitable here because I genuinely don't know which of these is true, and all 3 of them lead to the same place. Veritas Group was threatening to pull out of the deal entirely. A $200 million acquisition, 14 months of work, 11 days from close. 19 days after they walked me to the elevator. I called Gerald back on Wednesday morning. He answered on the first ring, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of things. "Callum," he said, "thank you for calling back." "Of course," I said. There was a pause. Gerald Vane was not a man accustomed to pausing. He was accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his preferences. The pause lasted long enough to be informative. "I imagine you're aware of the situation with Alderton-Moor," he said. "I've heard something," I said. "We're in a difficult position." Another pause. "The team has been working through the documentation you left, but there are some complexities that require some additional context." Complexities. I appreciated that word. It was doing a lot of work. "The pension liability calculation," I said, "and the tax exposure discrepancy." Yes, the relief in his voice at not having to name them himself was almost audible. Both items are documented," I said. "There's a memo attached to each one. The pension liability memo is dated 8 months ago. The tax exposure memo is dated 5 months ago. Both are in the shared folder, flagged in red with a recommended action attached." Silence. There's been some difficulty locating. "Folder is called Alderton-Moor Master," I said. "Subfolder. Open items. Both memos are there. The pension one is called PL Flag AUG, and the tax one is called Tax Exposure MAR. They are the only two documents in that subfolder with red flags in the file name. A longer silence. Callum! His voice shifted. Less executive. More human, briefly. I'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you back in, on a consultancy basis, to help close this deal. I looked out my window. It was a nice morning. The city was doing its thing. I appreciate that, I said. I've actually just accepted a position elsewhere, so my availability is limited. But I'm happy to have a conversation about what that might look like. Of course, of course. We'd make it worth your while. I'm sure we can find something that works, I said. Why don't you have someone send over a formal proposal and I'll take a look? The proposal arrived that afternoon. It was generous. More per day than my monthly salary had been. A short engagement at 10 days closed the deal, structured as an independent consultancy, so it wouldn't complicate my start date at Meridian. I called Soraya. I told her what had happened. There was a silence on her end, followed by a sound that I can only describe as a very controlled laugh. How much are they offering? She asked. I told her. Take it, she said, and then start here the week after. I'll move your start date. I want to hear how this ends. I called Gerald's assistant. I accepted the proposal with two conditions. First, I would work directly with the Veritas Group team, not through Marcus. Not around Marcus. Not despite Marcus. Simply, Marcus would not be in the room. Second, my name would appear on the deal documentation as lead analyst. Not as consultant. As lead analyst, the work had been mine for 14 months. The record would reflect that. There was a 20-minute gap between my sending those conditions and Gerald's assistant responding. The response was agreed to both. I found out later from someone still inside, Hargrove, who told me, over coffee with the expression of a person who needed to tell someone, that the conversation between Gerald and Marcus after that call lasted 11 minutes and was audible through a closed office door. I have no comment on that. I wasn't there. I walked back into Hargrove Capital on a Thursday morning. Security gave me a visitor badge for the building I had worked in for 7 years. I clipped it to my jacket and rode the elevator to the 31st floor and thought that if this were a film, there would be a significant musical moment here. Instead, there was just the elevator. And then the floor. And then the deal. I spent 4 days working through it. The pension liability was exactly what I had flagged. 8 months ago, a $6 million exposure that needed to be reflected in an adjusted purchase price or offset against an escrow arrangement. I had written the solution in the memo. It required one conversation with the sellers, lawyers, and 2 rounds of revision to the SPA. The tax exposure discrepancy was more delicate. It required a supplementary disclosure and a price adjustment mechanism that would kick in if the tax authority came back within 3 years with a different number. I had outlined the framework for this in the March memo. Building it out properly took 2 days and 1 very long call with a tax specialist I had worked with twice before who owed me, in a professional sense, a favor. On day 7, I presented the revised deal structure to the Veritas Group team. Their lead advisor, a careful, precise man named Henrik, who had been quietly skeptical about the deal for 6 weeks, based on what their own team had flagged, looked at the documentation for a long time. Then he looked at me. "This is the original analyst," he said. Not a question, a statement. He had done his homework. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "We were told you had left the firm." "I had," I said. "I came back for the deal." Henrik looked at the documentation again. Then he said something that I have thought about more than once since. "We would have pulled out," he said quietly. "If you hadn't come back?" "We had already drafted the notice." I didn't say anything. "The work is good," he said. It was always good. We could see that in the original structure. We just couldn't find anyone who understood it well enough to fix what had gone wrong. The deal closed 4 days later. $200 million, 14 months of work, 19 days of chaos that didn't need to happen. I started at Meridian Partners the following Monday. Soraya had put a bottle of good whiskey on my desk, not a celebration, she said, more of a welcome, and had scheduled me into 3 client meetings that week, all of which involved deals that reminded me, in their particular combination of complexity and opportunity, of why I had gone into this work in the first place. I did not follow what happened at Hargrove after I left. I had no reason to, but the same person who had told me about the 11-minute conversation came back to me 3 months later with an update I hadn't asked for. Marcus Vane had been moved to a client relations role. Not fired, moved. The kind of move that is designed to be kind to everyone involved and is kind to no one. Gerald apparently had developed a habit of asking, when new deals came in, whether anyone on the team had worked with the original analysts. A habit that had not existed before a Tuesday email and 19 days of a $200 million deal sitting without its architect. Henrik from Veritas Group had referred 2 new clients to Meridian Partners within 6 months. Both of them had asked, specifically, to work with me. I took both deals. I also, because I am precise about these things, updated my professional records to reflect my correct role on the Alderton-Moor acquisition. Lead analyst. Deal closed. $200 million. The record is the record. About 8 months into Meridian, Soraya and I were working late on a deal that had developed, as deals do, a last-minute complication involving a clause that nobody had read carefully enough. I was reading through it. She was watching me read through it with the expression of someone who has already decided it will be fine. Can I ask you something? She said. Always, I said, still reading. When Gerald called? When you let it ring the first time. A pause. What were you thinking? I looked up from the document. I thought about the elevator, the visitor badge, the 19 days, the legal pad with the pension liability calculation that someone hadn't read. I was thinking, I said, that 14 months of work doesn't disappear because 14 words say it does. Soraya looked at me for a moment. No, she said. It really doesn't. She went back to her document. I went back to mine. The clause, as it turned out, was fine. I had seen it before. I usually have. If this one landed, hit that like button and subscribe to Corporate Karma. New stories every week. Have you ever been the person they called back after they let you go? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And remember, the most dangerous professional in any industry isn't the one with the best title. It's the one who understood the deal well enough that the deal couldn't close without them.